Well, I was quite surprised by a question very casually posed to me by an old friend one day. We were just standing on a sidewalk, and he took a long drag on his cigarette and said, "Why do you still do this church stuff when you don't really believe anything?" The question reminded me of what I really like about preaching, because people sit quietly and I can indulge myself in the fantasy that they understand what I'm saying. But I can't be too hard on my friend. Most people were taught that they should be religious so that they go to heaven and avoid the fires of hell. I was only 10 or 11 years old when I pointed out to my parents that going to church in order to get that golden ticket to the train of glory was fundamentally a selfish thing to do, and it just couldn't be right. And my mother assured me what most of your mothers at some point assured you, is that faith is a matter of believing and not thinking. And generally, that has been true in most churches in most times of history. Even people who do think their way through the ridiculous church manipulation of that heavenly carrot on that hellish stick, they still go on believing that the only reason to be religious is some kind of divine fire insurance, which is why most modern people rarely, if ever, go to church, and why most movies, plays, novels that have a minister or a priest in the cast portray that person as a con man, a fraud, or an idiot. The 16th century founder of the Jesuit movement, St. Ignatius of Loyola, wrote the Spiritual Exercises, which shaped not only a lot of modern spiritual practice, but also became the outline of my doctoral dissertation. So this dead monk and I spent several years together. The genius of Ignatius was all built on this very familiar assumption. He writes, "Man is created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by this means to save his soul." There was a lot of good stuff in Ignatius, but chapter 1 starts with the assumption that the only reason you're reading this book and doing these exercises is so you won't go to hell. Now, that transactional approach to having a relationship with God should be obviously and morally and intellectually corrupt. I mean, I figured it out when I was a kid, and yet most people still believe that that is the reason why anyone is religious. And I think it should be obvious that it is the worst, the most reprehensible, and frankly, the most embarrassing reason to be religious. Though that might be why there's about 8,000 people down here at Six Flags Over Jesus down the road, and only 40 or 50 people here. But I'm not going to chase that rabbit into the woods today. But here's the overarching point that I want to make fundamentally about progressive faith, that the difference between a spiritual worldview and a selfish worldview is that a spiritual worldview acknowledges as its baseline that we are all connected. And to be clear, many humanists, atheists, and agnostics also affirm that that connection is real and profound and necessary. But most of the world, even most of religion, primarily approaches the world as an individual in competition for resources with the rest of the world. Now, you can see that dichotomy played out in both religious and secular circles. A fundamental belief of Buddhism is that any perception you have that you are separated from other people or from the earth itself is nothing but an illusion, that you are connected. Looked at for its virtue rather than negatively, the whole spiritual transformation sought in Christian monasticism is a denial of self, denial of possessions, that's the vow of poverty, of appetites, the vow of chastity. You set aside all of your appetites so that your ego boundaries collapse enough for you to feel connected to your faith community, to the world, to God, and to everything else. I wrote a book about this 20 years ago. I'm still waiting for Oprah to discover it and endorse it. At this point, there's several cases of it in my garage, so anyone that would like a free copy, you're welcome to it. But it's not just religious people who affirm this view that we're all connected. There are very few things in life that make me happier than listening to the auto-tuned voices of physicists with these snippets that Melody Sheep took out of some of their TED Talks and some of their lectures on physics that affirm that even from a scientific perspective, we are all connected, so that they are literally repeating what Christian mystics and Buddhist monks have been telling us for hundreds of years. Let me just share a couple of minutes of one video with you. This is worth it.
We're all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically.
I think nature's imagination is so much greater than man's. He's never gonna let us relax.
We live in an in-between universe where things change alright, but according to patterns, rules, or as we call them, laws of nature.
I'm this guy standing on a planet. Really, I'm just a speck. Compared with a star. The planet is just another speck. To think about all of this, to think about the vast emptiness of space. There's billions and billions of stars, billions and billions of specks.
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together. The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
Across the sea of space, the stars are others. We've traveled this way before, and there is much to be learned.
We're all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically.
I find it elevating and exhilarating to discover that we live in a universe which permits the evolution of molecular machines as intricate and subtle as we.
Boy, I hope you all love that too. I could explain it to you, but I can't make you understand it, so you either love it or you don't. But I play that in the background while I'm working all the time. But what does it really mean to say that we're all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, and to the universe atomically? I think that Martin Luther King Jr. said it very clearly. All this is simply to say that all life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. As long as there is poverty in this world, no one can be totally rich, even if that person has $1 billion. As long as diseases are rampant and millions of people cannot expect to live more than 20 or 30 years, no one can be totally healthy, even if he just got a clean bill of health from the finest clinic in America. Strangely enough, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. The issue comes up in political debates in the most disgraceful way. Now, whether you're in favor of Medicare for all or a single-payer plan or universal health care, however, anyone who does not want a plan that includes everyone that advocates for a plan that gives me good health insurance but leaves millions of people uninsured, that person is somehow failing to be fully human. They have medical coverage that they like, and they don't want to change a system that works for them, even if it means that hundreds of thousands of people die prematurely and unnecessarily. What kind of a callous monster could be so heartless as to suggest that people with high salaries and good jobs should get the best health care, and people who are less affluent should just die sooner and suffer more? Who could be so devoted to a caste system in which the upper class gets great care and the lower class gets little or none, or faces the whole sewer of medical bankruptcy, payday loans, or constant fear about getting their next vial of life-preserving insulin? When the talking heads on the morning shows discuss Democratic debates, their hair catches on fire at the notion that in the last debate, all of the candidates said that they favored giving health care to illegal immigrants. Well, what else would you do? Would you just let them die on the side of the road? And when any of these people are vacationing in England or France or Spain or Germany, when they get sick, when they break a tooth on their damn caviar spoon, what do? They go get health care, and it's given to them. You go and get virtually free health care because that is what happens in a civilized nation. There is a mentality in this nation that simply seems to reel in fear that somebody might get something for nothing, that somebody might get some benefit for which the general public has to pay for it. Does Joe Scarborough believe that he earns $14 million a year for simply interrupting intelligent people on the set of Morning Joe 5 days a week? If wealth were tied to hard work, if pay was based on labor, the richest people in the world would be the women who live in sub-Saharan Africa. How long would Joe Scarborough be able to carry water on top of his head for miles every day while scrounging for firewood to prepare a meal for his family? Anyone who is born white, male, and heterosexual in North America starts out in life on third base with every possible advantage given to those who got those advantages through plundering the entire globe for 2 centuries. And then they managed to muster some rage about providing health care to someone who happens to be in Texas, as if being in Texas alone is not bad enough. But they happen to be there when they get ill or have an accident. If you don't get that you take care of sick people, it could be that you are simply beyond being taught. Now, when I go speak in Great Britain, I go with no worries about needing medical care while I'm there. If something happens to me while I'm in England, I will be taken to the National Healthcare Service and I'll be taken care of free of charge. But when my friends in England come to the United States, they have to buy a temporary health insurance policy because they know when they come to the United States, we will not necessarily take care of them if they have an accident or fall ill. Because we have not yet arrived at the point of being a rational, civilized nation that understands that illness is not an opportunity to make a profit. Illness is a problem that has to be solved by rational, empathetic, compassionate human beings, which we are apparently short of at this time. We are all connected. If you recognize that you are a part of a civilization, then, okay, live in a giant house in a gated community, but make sure that there's nobody living homeless before you do that. Of course, hard work, ingenuity, discipline will always be rewarded by a better and a more comfortable life. It should be. But demanding that others must suffer in order to add to your comfort or your security, that's just obscene. Does anyone really need for me to explain that? Isn't that obvious? Now, sadly, many people only become woke to ethical issues when it affects them personally. I have a German friend whom I get to see now and then, and his sense of humor, and this just may be what we were saying earlier, this just may be the way Germans basically have no sense of humor. So The best way that they know how to tell a joke is to double up their fist and punch you right below the belt. And that is more or less the nature of my relationship with this guy. But we were having breakfast recently, and we were just catching up on our various travels, publications, and work, and I was telling him about the work I do with a support group of parents whose kids are in prison for having been found to possess child pornography. And he shook his head and laughed vigorously, and he said, "How do you always get tied up with so many messy people?" And he said, "In Germany we have a saying," I'm going to quote it literally, forgive me, "but shit draws flies." However, when he learned that one of the young men is the son of a German friend of his view of the whole problem changed in a second. And he immediately wanted to know what he could do to be helpful and supportive to the family. And I said, "Aren't you afraid of drawing flies?" The real test of sincere compassion is to care about someone for whom you have no social ties. If I'm generous with my daughter, no one's going to build a statue for that. You don't get to be considered noble because you're generous with your own kids. But if I'm generous with the kid of someone I've never met, maybe there I'm coming closer to fulfilling what we say about a spirituality in which we are all connected, in which even a stranger in crisis is as connected to me as my daughter or your daughter or you. I want to see people of faith being concerned about the 2 million people who were incarcerated even before one of your children is incarcerated. I want people to begin to show empathy to those who are at the butt end of being mistreated by society even before it comes to your door. If you're not concerned about the opioid crisis when we're having 60,000 overdose deaths a year just because you don't personally know anyone who has been addicted to opioids, well, let me just tell you, just wait, because it's coming to a family near you. We liberals have done a lot of hand-wringing over the past 2 years about how people continue to support Donald Trump even after all he has said and done about immigration and race and poverty issues. But nowhere has the heartless nature of his administration been more on display than in this child separation policy at the border. How can anyone witness this nightmare of traumatizing 15,000 children and still support Trump? And this is why I chose the definition of schadenfreude as our wisdom lesson today. There are those who have speculated that the suffering at the border, the suffering of those applying for asylum or for immigration that are being denied, they say the suffering is the feature and not a bug. Now, I'm not saying that this is true for everyone, but at least at some level, the way that Trump is satisfying his base is by making other people suffer. The suffering is actually attractive to them. Now, their own salaries may be going down. Their manufacturing jobs may be being exported offshore. There are potholes in their roads. Their kids can't afford to go to college. Their kids can't even afford to get their teeth fixed. But at least these poor brown people at the border are suffering more than my family member is suffering. And that is somehow satisfying at the most humiliating base level of what it means to be human. I'm not saying that's everyone that continues to support Trump, but there is no one here who can deny that this is not part of the mix, that making other people suffer is somehow satisfying to those who feel like life is not treating them fairly. And that not only makes me ashamed that Donald Trump is our president, it makes me ashamed that 40% of the people around us still support him. Now, I asked Rob to be our liturgist this morning because of his ongoing work with the movement to abolish capital punishment. But this very week, our Attorney General, Bill Barr, just say boo. Thanks. I shouldn't have to prompt you all for that one. Let's go back. This week, our Attorney General, Bill Barr, thank you, announced that our federal government would end its own moratorium on capital punishment and take steps to execute some of the more than 60 federal prisoners on death row, demonstrating to me once again that the Trump administration not only cannot do anything right, but they seem rather determined to dismember modern civilization brick by brick. Now, I'm opposed to the death penalty, even in the face of the most egregious crimes, because if the criminal has been arrested and is in prison, killing them is just social revenge. If they've already been captured, they do not represent a danger to society. So killing them isn't justice, it's murder. But even if you cannot join me in feeling connected, even to the most guilty among us, I want to remind you, our justice system is flawed. Remember Bill Barr? He's in charge of the justice system. Our justice system is so flawed, I wouldn't let them balance my checkbook, let alone make decisions about who should live and who should die. Our justice system is so corrupt that an 18-year-old kid on the autism spectrum can be sent to prison for 15 years because they visited the wrong website on their laptop. But this guy, Jeffrey Epstein, can get away with trafficking young girls as sex slaves to his home in New York, his home in Florida, and to a private island, and do it for years. And even when law enforcement at every level has turned away and looked away, even when he's finally brought to trial, he receives a sentence so light that it would have embarrassed the most corrupt government in the most remote of third world countries. Our judicial system routinely releases the worst criminals in the world who are rich while jailing the minor offenses of the poor. And we should trust them with life and death decisions? Hell no. Since DNA testing has become more available in criminal defense, dozens of death row inmates have been pardoned and released. But there's not DNA evidence in every case, so we don't know how many would be released if they had maintained records. And in many cases, there was DNA evidence which the police have lost or destroyed. Fair estimates are that 1 in every 25 prisoners who are executed were innocent. 3 or 4 out of every 100 people that are executed were not guilty of what they were charged of. So let me just ask you, how many people do we have to kill as a society before our government becomes guilty of murder? I would say 1, but if 1's not enough for you, if you screw up and kill a dozen, 15, 30, 40 innocent people, at what point do our state and federal governments become guilty of murder? And because they represent us, how do we get to be innocent in that exchange? There is no reason to execute even guilty people who have already been captured and are no longer a danger to society. But to execute the innocent? Because we continue to accept this justice system that is for sale. Don't kid yourself for a moment. Our justice system is for sale. This is morally intolerable. And the fact that we keep putting up with it year after year embarrasses me. Any sense that you may have ever had that you're not connected to the millions of people who languish in prisons, even the ones on death row, is an illusion. We are connected to the immigrant, the refugee, the convicted criminals, and the mothers who are carrying their children on their backs to escape a civil war or gang violence, to bring their babies to safety. Would you do any less than that? Wouldn't you? I want to close with a favorite preacher story. And like a lot of preacher stories, it may be entirely fictitious, but since that never stopped anyone that wrote in the Bible, I'm not going to let it stop me. If you've heard it before, don't stop me. It's been said that during the dark days of the Depression, that the famous New York mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, would sometimes put on magistrate robes and go sit in a municipal court in the middle of the night. Into a courtroom typically filled with pimps and prostitutes and pushers, the bailiff brought in a haggard-looking old woman who had been caught stealing bread from a local grocer. The woman cried and begged for mercy, explaining that her grandchildren were literally starving and that she stole bread only to give them something to eat. The grocer, however, was resolute. She had to be found guilty and fined, or everybody in the neighborhood would start stealing from his store. It's said that LaGuardia then banged his gavel on the bench, found the woman guilty, and charged her a fine of $10. But even as he was pronouncing the fine, he was standing up, reaching into his own pocket, and threw $10 on the bench. LaGuardia then banged his gavel again and announced that everyone in the room was guilty of living in a city where a grandmother has to steal bread to be able to feed her children. And he took his hat off, handed it to the bailiff, and collected 50 cents from everyone in the courtroom that was then given to the defendant, a fine that even a very red-faced grocer had to pay. Now, folks, we all live in a nation that is imprisoning the poor on our behalf, on our dime. Our tax dollars are keeping those 15,000 kids in deplorable concentration camps on the border. Our elected government is a reflection of who we are as a nation, and that is what must be changed. Immigrants are not the reason why there are poor people in America. Race is not the cause of crime in America. The people on death row cannot and will not hurt you. I know I should always end a sermon like this with meaningful suggestions about what we can do to change things, but what comes to my mind that needs to be said is that Americans must stop being afraid all of the time. Don't vote out of fear of criminals. Don't vote out of fear of immigrants. Don't vote out of fear of minorities or even vegetarians. Vegetarians are just making more bacon available for the rest of us. Be thankful for vegetarians. I'm glad that I have access to good health care, but I get to live in a better world if you have the same access that I do. I'm glad I was able to feed my daughter and send her to college. But the world is better if your kids get to eat well and go to college too. We must reject the politics and religion that allows us to find some satisfaction, no matter how private, from the suffering of others. Sincere empathy, radical compassion, that's the spiritual choice we want to make. And we have to put it into practice every day until we don't have to live in a city where a grandmother has to steal bread to feed her own grandchildren. Now, I'll warn you, when you start doing this, you might draw some flies. But like they said in Baltimore recently, it's better to have some rats around than to be one.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.